Hi, I'm Mark Safe here. In this lesson, we're going to talk about the holy grail of tournament poker, playing heads up for the title. Making it to heads up play is a great accomplishment, but it's no time to sit back and relax. There are two key factors to heads up play. First, you need to be able to objectively judge your skill level compared to that of your opponent. Assuming that both you and your opponent have stacks of 50 big blinds or more, making the honest assessment of how your game compares to your opponent's is crucial because this will dictate your strategy for the match. If you honestly think your opponent is better than you are, then you're going to want to play more aggressively against him pre-flop. This means raising and re-raising in order to force your opponent to gamble more and to take away whatever edge he may have in post-flop play. If, on the other hand, you think you're better than your opponent, you should be looking to play small ball poker before the flop. By keeping the pot size small pre-flop, you're risking fewer chips when there is more luck involved, and risking more chips after the flop when you have more information which you will use to outplay your opponent. One important exception here is if you're playing an opponent who's folding too many hands before the flop. If your opponent is showing this kind of weakness, then you may choose to play more aggressively against him before the flop because he's offering such little resistance. To successfully play small ball poker here, you're going to want to make small raises of just over 2 times the big blind when you're on the button and have position. Since your opponent is almost always going to call because of the pot odds he's getting, all you're really doing is taking the lead in the hand while keeping the pot size small. Once you're involved in the hand, you'll be in position and can use your usual arsenal of post-flop weapons, paying particularly close attention to floating your opponent as often as is practical. Remember, since it's difficult to flop a quality hand heads up, floating here can be particularly effective. If either you or your opponent have stacks of less than 25 big blinds, chances are that small ball poker won't even be an option. In this case, there are 3 common ways for stack sizes to come into play. 1, you are short stacked. 2, your opponent is short stacked. Or 3, both you and your opponent are short stacked. If your stack is 15 big blinds or less, you should be open shoving. This way, you have a chance to double up and have a stack that's healthy enough to see a flop or even re-raise your opponent. If you are sitting on around 15 big blinds, you know your opponent will be open raising quite often. Use a stack of this size to re-shove from the big blind because it will be difficult for your opponent to call that big raise without a strong hand. If your opponent is the one sitting on the short stack, be careful of taking the bait if he re-shoves on you. Remember, you need a substantially stronger hand to call with than you do to raise with. So be willing to fold your hand here and look for a better spot. If your opponent is very tight and willing to fold his big blind, then you can raise him pre-flop without much fear of him playing back at you. However, depending on the strength of your hand, say for example you have Jack 10 or suited connectors, and your opponent is loose or aggressive, just limp into the pot and look to hit the flop big. If you have a small or medium pair or a big ace, you'll want to raise enough to make your aggressive opponent play for all of his chips. By limping into the pot, you essentially force your opponent into making an all or nothing decision. Most opponents will either check or go all in. If your opponent goes all in, you can dump your hand because you're not getting the right price to call. If he checks, now you're playing a small pot in position with a hand that can potentially flop big and give you the title. In situations where both you and your opponent are short stacked, the advantage goes to the most aggressive pre-flop player. In this spot, there's no reason to try and play post-flop poker. Instead, you should be open shoving and re-raising in order to pick up all the pre-flop fold equity you can.